Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Mr. Brisker. Do you hear me?
Morning. Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, yeah, you are clear, much clearer today. But there is an echo now. There is an echo. Don't you have more than one device there?
Much better.
Much better. Oh, no. Then it's not better. The joys of online hearings. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Can you come back?
Yes, I can hear you.
There doesn't seem to be an echo anymore, does it?
It is improved.
Well, yeah, it's done more than improve. I don't think there's an echo now. Certainly from this side. Are you happy, IT people? As far as I recall, Mr. Bresky, you were going to deal with Ompile Ramela, or you were going to take off from paragraph 119 of your affidavit. And
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
yes.
Okay, the floor is mine.
Yes, it is yours.
Thank you, sir. Moving on from paragraph 119, as you correctly say, we are dealing with the submission of Mr. Ramela. As you are aware, Mr. Ramela was executive committee member from 2014 to 2020 of SACA and was president in 2018. He also represented SACA with Mr. Irish at the FICA AGM in London in July 2019. So he was very active in SACA. His presidency, as I note there, coincided with a period of significant conflict between SACA and CSA, which culminated in a court application to have the Members' Council decision rescinded on the restructure, and Mr. Ramela actually deposed to the founding affidavit of that court application, which was a significant action on the part of SACA to protect the interests of all our cricketers, and actually, I will argue further and say to protect professional cricket in South Africa. So Mr. Ramela played an instrumental role in stabilising the game at the time. In October last year, he also led our SACA executive delegation in 2 formal engagements with Mr. Nathi Mthethwa, Minister of Sport, Arts and Culture, and also led the call for the then CSA board to stand down and for the recommendations of the well-known Nicholson Commission to be implemented. At the end of last year, end of October, the SACA executive nominated Mr. Ramela to be our nominee on the CSA interim board. You know the history of the interim board that was put in place to stabilise cricket by the minister. And SACA had a nominee on that board, and we nominated Mr. Ramela, and he served on that board until his dismissal as director on the CSA interim board in December 2020. It resulted in him initiating legal action against the interim board, and that termination was in terms of Section 71 of the Companies Act. I go on further in the affidavit, and I won't touch on things to recognise Mr. Ramela's frustration at his career, how it ended at the Lions, and how discussions around that last year led us to our player development plan, which we discussed a lot yesterday. I think that would have been a great benefit to him. And I also confirm Mr. Ramela did serve the players with diligence for a long period of time. I'd like to get on to paragraph 126, where I deal with the meeting that Professor Fall dealt with. So I'll try and be brief. I know we've got a time constraint because CSA are waiting outside. It's the meeting in Cape Town where Mr. Ramela references that Mr. Enoch Nkwe was called to attend by Saka, purportedly where Professor Jacques Fall was to address him on his future as Proteas coach. I have to say, Saka at no stage ever invited Mr. Nkwe to a meeting, and one can only assume that Mr. Nkwe or Ramela both are confused in this regard, referencing a different meeting. The meeting that Mr. Ramela is referring to did take place on the 11th of December. As you would have heard from Professor Fall, he was appointed on that weekend on the 7th of the 8th December as the acting CEO, and he was tasked, one of his first tasks was he had to repair this broken relationship that he had with Saka, that CSA had with Saka. It was openly hostile at that stage, and Mr. Fall convened a meeting, and you can see he was called to that meeting on Annexure 10, page 152. It's just the meeting request, and you can see that Mr. Nkwe wasn't called to that meeting. I'm not sure where that misunderstanding arose. Was another person at that meeting was Mr. Dave Richardson, who'd been appointed by the board to oversee the restructure. And again, we were critical to that because part of the consultation process, we needed to be included in that. So he was in the meeting. Mr. David Becker was in the meeting, who was at that stage, the week before, had been appointed a consultant to us. And the various issues in dispute between SACA and CSA were discussed in that meeting. If you have a look at the Annexure ACB 11, that is an email from Mr. Irish, who was then in his last week as CEO at SACA. And that is the email he sent that very same day, confirming effectively what had been discussed throughout that meeting. And you'll see there, the first was the CSA board issue. Second was our High Court application. The CSA board, the message from Jacques Fall was that they wanted us to withdraw our court application, and we refused until such time as the Members' Council rescinded their decision. And that rescinding of their decision actually happened in January of the next year of 2020. So that was discussed. The domestic restructure was discussed, as you can see, the MSL Dream 11, which was a little commercial dispute that was going on, and the CSA-SACA relationship and how we improve it. There was no discussion of Mr. Nkwe or Mr. Graham Smith because there was no discussion about it. It was not an agenda item in that meeting. So I'm somewhat perplexed by Mr. Ramela's statement that the decision to appoint Graham Smith as CSA director was taken at that meeting. We have no business as to who CSA appoints operationally or at any other level. And it was not under discussion. It's not our business. I can say at the time, there was extensive media speculation about whether Mr. Smith would become director of cricket. It had been in the papers probably for 2-3 weeks, but it had nothing to do with SACA. I referenced Annexure ACB 12 there, which is effectively Mr. Irish, before he sent out that email confirming the meeting, he sent the draft email to myself and to Mr. Ramela, and you will note there I made one little addition to the email, and Mr. Ramela's response is, "Good day, Tony, you can definitely send it through." So he had sight of that email and was happy with the content thereof, and there was no mention on the issue of Smith or position of Nkwe. Mr. Ramela was president for 11 months subsequent to that meeting, and never once was the narrative raised related to Nkwe. So it's just not on point. I'd also like to just refer to Annexure ABC 7, so we go back slightly, which is David Becker's confirmatory supplementary affidavit, where he sets out in great detail the meeting and information there that I was actually not aware of until I read his affidavit about the meeting that took place that afternoon with Mr. Smith and Professor Fall, where effectively those discussions did take place. We were not at that meeting. Even, as I say, I was unaware of that meeting. I won't go through that affidavit in detail. It's there, you can read it. I just would state, go to paragraph 9 of that affidavit on page 147, where Mr. July, you actually say, I still don't understand, Mpili, why this meeting was held at SACA's office discussing the appointments. And you are correct, Mr. July, as Mr. Becker says here, Mr. Ramela's version of events in this regard does not make sense because it actually is just not true. 2 separate meetings, and I don't know where the confusion came in, but we had nothing to do with Mr. Nkwe, we had nothing to do with Mr. Smith, and I think the confirmatory affidavits and the annexures can confirm that. Moving on, just on paragraph 127, a couple of statements that I'll just deal with briefly in Mr. Ramela's submission, that SACA is there to preserve its members' commercial interests, and that this objective can clash with CSA's developmental and transformation and humanitarian interests, and SACA's interests can override those of transformation. The difficult statement. SACA's interests are to protect and promote our professional cricketers in the country. That ensures players aren't exploited, that they receive fair remuneration and benefits, able to develop as cricketers and individuals, are physically and mentally safe and looked after, have access to benefits to improve their life, and are able to contract freely. It's difficult to accept an argument that by protecting and promoting those interests, you are clashing with CSA's objectives, especially when you're dealing with the asset, the players, that generates all CSA's revenue. Without the players, CSA has no revenue. And it's that revenue that funds the entire pyramid of cricket in South Africa. By pyramid, I mean all the development levels that go down below. And I would argue that the protection and promotion of our cricketers is critical to the development and transformation objectives of CSA. I do need to go into a bit of detail to actually explain what I think will be interesting information to you on the structure of the financial model. And I hope I do it well because it can be technical. The player payment pool, which I touched on yesterday, which is all the cost of the Proteas men and domestic cricketers, is always a percentage of Cricket South Africa's defined revenue over 4 years. Now, very important point, defined revenue has a specific definition in our collective agreements. It does not equate to CSA's turnover in any given year. And it does not, for example, critical point, include sponsorship, financial in kind, or monies that are related to the development of the game. So this is to ensure that when I say the player cost is 23.1% of defined revenue, that we are not calculating the cost of players based on revenue that is reserved for development. Now, we agreed this definition because development is such a critical imperative for cricket in this country. We are the only country in the world in cricket where the players' share of revenue is based on a specific smaller defined amount and not all revenue. Australian cricket, for example, it's an all revenue, whatever it might be. And that is specifically because of our acknowledgement of how we need to separate where money is specifically designated for development, that it doesn't come into the calculation of the player cost. A good example of that is, for example, the KFC sponsorship of Cricket South Africa. That KFC sponsorship of Cricket South Africa is directly related to development and development needs. So the money comes in, it's for development. That is not included in the calculation of defined revenue as to what player cost will be. So that actually is a critically important piece of understanding of how our model is created, taking into consideration the imperatives of the development of the game. So I cannot agree with the statement that the players' interests can override CSA's interests in the areas of development and transformation. My explanation hopefully explains how we actually include that critically in the whole definition of how we calculate our revenues. As I said earlier, yesterday, the PPP for this current season is 190 million rand, and Of this, 27 million relates to commercial rights. I touched on that yesterday. That's only 14.4% of that amount. The rest, 85.6%, is for the contracts, the benefits of the players, and to protect the players. And I can't accept that that clashes with the objectives of CSA. I can break it down further and say, on the basis of the PPP being 23.1% of defined revenue, the remaining 76.9% of CSA's defined revenue. So we're now talking about 76.9% of their remaining defined revenue and their other revenue that's earmarked for development is actually available for development and transformation. So it's a significant percentage that we're talking about. An alternative view is for me to say, you can take 19.6 of CSA's defined revenue. That is me taking away the commercial, and that funds the only asset that Cricket South Africa has that produces revenue. So if you're looking at a business model, it's slightly flawed in that approaches generate all the revenue, but it's a very successful one for Cricket South Africa when the player through the money is available for development is actually only 19.6%. Breaking it down further, the actual Proteas men's cost is 50% of the PPP cost. So I'm just trying to create, and I know it can get technical and you can read through it again at your leisure, how this model fits together, taking into consideration the unique imperatives that we have in South African cricket around transformation and development. It's built into the MOU. And as such, we don't go outside of defined revenue, which is revenue that excludes revenue that is specifically earmarked for transformation and development. So I would submit that whichever way you view it, there's no merit in that argument. I go into paragraph 128. Where Mr. Ramela speaks about he witnessed numerous instances of SACA attempting to exert undue influence over the administrative affairs of CSA. He doesn't provide examples, but references numerous instances. I dealt with this yesterday. We consult on issues, we negotiate on issues, we're a trade union, we push hard. Mr. Ramela himself, in our openly hostile relationship with CSA, which was well documented, was the period Mr. Ramela was actually president. And we were at that stage excluded from all Cricket South Africa committees. So actually we weren't even engaging with Cricket South Africa. So it doesn't really follow the logic of the period when he was president, because we actually were out in the cold at Cricket South Africa. There was no communication, let alone possible undue influence. With reference to my paragraph 129, which is Mr. Ramela referencing his meeting with Mr. Welsh-Gwaza, or rather the issue of Mr. Welsh-Gwaza. Yes, I was called to a meeting with the interim board in November 2020, and a number of issues were discussed, and Mr. Welsh-Gwaza was one of them. And I was asked whether I was aware of any acts of misconduct on the part of Mr. Gwaza. And save for the fact that I stated that Mr. Gwaza had an openly negative attitude towards SACA, which I've always attributed to him having a misunderstanding of our role, I was not able to provide any substantial assistance. I did reference him as a power broker, because I do believe he had influence on the governance of CSA at the time. But Mr. Gwaza was dismissed from CSA, and I've actually annexed the executive summary of his findings of his disciplinary, which on CSA's website. And you can read them, and you'll see that there's not even a reference to SACA. So I'm a bit uncertain as to the intention behind that submission. Moving on to paragraph 30. Ramela states that our undue influence over CSA suggests that SACA is compromising the quality performance we could be experiencing from the game. Yeah, Mr. Ramela was part of our executive for 6 years. And I can't accept there's any truth in that statement. To a certain extent, is a self-indictment on his own leadership of the organization over that tumultuous time, and he was a very active leader in the organization. I would rather say that the truth of the matter is, at a time of great turmoil in cricket, SACA created certainty and consistency for all players. Most importantly, contract security at a time of great insecurity, and that made significant contribution to the success of the game. Moving on briefly, Mr. Ramela makes a number of statements about our commercial rights program. And he's aware of how it works, has been an executive committee member. Obviously, the formula are communicated to all our members on an annual basis. Players are invited to ask any details that relate to the payments. We did go through this yesterday. There is no ranking in the payments, save for ICC events where there's a ranking, but there is no ranking in payments in that regard. And Mr. Ramela's statements around CSA not knowing what happens to the money, you need to remember the commercial rights payments received by the trust, it's an arm's length commercial agreement. There's an agreement in place. And that is a formal agreement. And for a fee, CSA received from the trusts the collective player rights utilized for their commercial partners. But just like the trusts don't actually have insight into who CSA's commercial partners are, we don't get involved in negotiating CSA's contracts with the commercial partners. There's no legal right for CSA to be able to see what happens to the money once it's landed on the other side of the contract. That's, again, nothing in contract allows that. Having said that, in the 2018 MOU negotiation, we actually invited CSA to view the payments made to players. There's no, save for the confidentiality requirement, there's no issue with transparency on how these payments are made. CSA never took up that offer, and if it's on this platform, I again offer to CSA, Valetti as the CEO, they want to see the payments, subject to the confidentiality issues, they are free to. They, like I say, have no issue around transparency of that. Mr. Ramela never raised these issues that he set out while he was on the executive committee. And in fact, we had discussions around how do we increase our commercial footprint in the cricket space. And it's a constant discussion around players. Mr. Ramela goes on in paragraph 132, makes statements about our undue influence, choking development transformation, SACA more powerful than CSA. I again state I don't believe there's a foundation. He was actually instrumental himself in championing the player cause, ensuring that the players remain a strong stakeholder. And that statement contradicts his actions as a president. We are no different to other players' associations in the world in terms of the work that we do. My paragraph 134, your discussion that you had with Mr. Ramela relating to transformation was interesting. I'll start by saying SACA is not neutral on transformation. We canvassed that yesterday. And as a member of the Cricket Committee and Chief Executives, we engage on the issue of transformation. The issue of commoditization is also raised at those forums. And I'd like to think, like I said, we've got rid of it with the restructure. Mr. Ramela agrees SACA should not be involved in selection, but he highlights a role for SACA in holding CSA and the provinces to account in shortcomings in this regard. He's got a valid point there. And that's why we had discussions last year, which included discussions with Mr. Ramela as he was on the executive, around our player development process, because that's where I believe you can hold the provinces to account. And that's exactly the point that we've made yesterday. Where I would disagree in that conversation is Mr. Ramela started speaking about SACA getting involved in the performance, engaging on the performance. I'm not so sure about that. I think that's very much a coach-player issue, where it's relative to the PDP, yes, but I think one has to be careful when one's getting involved operationally where they actually are dealing with a player performance. But holding provinces to account for that PDP process, most definitely, I do believe that's what we should be doing. 135, Mr. Ramela referenced allegations of discrimination in the contracting during the 2021-22 contracting window. That he forwarded an email correspondence on the 23rd of March to the CSA Interim Board, Members Council and SACA, setting out his concerns at the time. That goes to Annexure ACB 15 on page 187. You have that there. The wording of that is actually interesting, identical to the anonymous submission to the SJN. Despite the email not containing a specific allegation, we acted on that email immediately. The next annexure, ACB 16, was actually it's a trail of emails, which was my immediate response to Mr. Ramela saying that this is a pressing issue, we'll take it up immediately. and that we would undertake a comprehensive analysis of the contracting for the season once the window has closed. This email came halfway through the window. I also say there, at the top of Annexure ACB 16, we will be engaging with every Black African player to assess their experience. And we did do that. And we provided guidance where required and engaged with the players. Mr. Ramela, to suggest that our direct engagement with our members was an attempt to find out which players have complained, it's really, I have to say, cynical. We're an organization that looks to protect players' rights. If you get a complaint that a certain group of players are having a problem, are in trouble, are being unfairly treated, you engage directly with these players. No different to all our members who suffered under the KZN violence. We sat down and my team phoned every single player in that region. It's the approach of a trade union that is good at its job. And every Black African player was actually contacted to get an understanding of where they were in their contracting process and if they were having issues. It was a proactive move, and not, there was no other intent behind it. Interestingly enough, our discussion in those calls with Black African players, the key issue that was raised by them was more along the lines of some players who were in 2-year contracts were actually hoping to get out of those 2-year contracts because they'd been approached for better contracts. And so it was more a discussion around that contract issue. An outcome of that was that some players were able to negotiate exits from 2-year contracts and move at the time. Closing off on Mr. Ramela, we're a players' association for all players, irrespective of race and gender. The emphasis on the commercial program is misplaced. The great benefit to every SACA member comes in the comprehensive support, legal support, opportunity to develop as a person outside the game of cricket. And Mr. Ramela himself benefited extensively from SACA's initiatives in this regard, and we're very pleased that he did, because that's a measure of success for SACA is when players benefit from them. I worked closely with Mr. Ramela for the past 6 years. We together have fought hard for the players' cause, often against significant odds. I respect him and I supported him personally in his appointment to the interim board of Cricket South Africa, as I believed he would play a major role in establishing proper governance and stability at the structure of CSA. His subsequent termination from the interim board of CSA was a body blow for me personally and for SACA. I'm disappointed in any of his statements, which are inaccurate, and I believe undermine many of the principles. I'd like to move on to Mr. Prince, and I'm nearly done.
You move to Mr. Prince. I just want to remind you, Mr.
Yes.
Briske, we've got your affidavit.
I know.
And reading every paragraph, I know that you had to refer us to those paragraphs in respect of Ramela. We've got time constraints.
With Mr. Ramela and Mr. Prince,
yes. Sorry.
With Mr. Ramela and Mr. Prince, there are various statements that have been publicly made that I need to respond to, and it will relate more to these affidavits as relative to the rest. I know we have constraints in that regard, so I will be brief.
I think the point that Mr. Chula makes is that where you feel that in the affidavit and for purposes of speaking to the public, where certain allegations were made by Ramela or whoever, it would be in the interest of everybody, including the time constraints that we are operating under. If you said the remainder of my affidavit is as significant as it should be, and I refer to paragraph so-and-so, so-and-so, and you give a summary of what those paragraphs are saying. And then, without having to read line by line everything that is in your affidavit, because all it means is that you are transferring what is in your affidavit into the record. And it is manifestly clear from all the responses that we've been giving that you say to the extent that this was in the public place, and then in the public place I need to respond there too. But you already have a view, certainly my view, that you can make very telling points in response to what was said when the evidence of the players was taken, without having to go line by line or paragraph by paragraph of your affidavit. But as I said,
Really noted, Mr. Chair.
yeah,
I will recognise that and do my best just on Mr. Prince to touch on a few points that he raises, which I feel need to be spoken about. Yes.
My apologies. Before we proceed to Mr. Prince, I was just wondering, because as you had referenced earlier on, or yesterday rather, you made a reference to Prof. Odendal's comments about, sorry, I need to take this off, about Prof. Odendal's comments during the SJN hearings that SACA has in the past been a stumbling block to transformation. And now we heard Umpile's testimony as well, that SACA, has also sort of stood in the way of transformation. And so those are two participants that have come forward, and SACA is now denying that. Is that correct?
It is correct.
Right. So I'm just wondering, why. Yeah, I'm just wondering why those two participants would come to the SJN and make those statements.
I think it would have been easier for me to respond to those statements had there been a specific, here's an incident where we see SACA has been an obstruction to transformation. In responding to Mr. Ramela, where it's been said that, for example, the commercial program, the focus on the commercial program or the MOU takes away from transformation, I'd like to think my explanation says, well, that might be a perception, but effectively I refute that by saying, well, the structure actually caters for transformation and development. So I understand people might have that perception, but I'd like to think that some of the information I brought forward counters that.
No, thank you, Mr. Pritzker.
As per wishes, Mr. Chair, I'll touch briefly on a few points of Mr. Prince, given our time constraints. Mr. Prince references SACA being too powerful. He references the player contract that SACA draws up. The MOU contains the player contract. The MOU is an agreed document. The player contract is agreed between CSA, the provinces, and SACA. Professor Halton Cheadle actually drafted on behalf of CSA in that process. Western Province Cricket, the employer, erstwhile employer of Mr. Prince, was a signatory to that. It's not a SACA document. We don't control it. He says CSA has signed off on clauses where SACA is allowed to earn between 22 and 25% of annual CSA revenue. I've just explained in great detail how the MOU works. We do not get 23.1% of the revenue. It's an amount that is agreed, that is controlled within the budget of Cricket South Africa on the player cost. And you'll see me explain that through pages 98. The great benefit to CSA is that it actually controls their most important budget item. I'll reference you to ACB 17, which actually sets out in detail every cost that is catered for in the MOU, from the Proteas payments to the match fees, to the series wins bonus, etc. So it's not money that gets paid to SACA. SACA gets no money from CSA. I said that yesterday, and I would to repeat it again. Mr. Ramela speaks about assessing the major money-earning positions. Sorry, Mr. Prince says the Ombudsman should assess the major money-earning positions of SACA. I deal with that in page 99. If he's insinuating that employees of SACA or the board are benefiting unlawfully, then that is just unacceptable. It's devoid of any truth and insulting. Our board, Mr. Gerald Gross, Ms. Lele Mekla-Makulu, Dr. Mohammed Musiji, and Mr. Kara Zondo earn 5,000 Rand per formal board meeting a year. They're 3 a year, that's 15,000 Rand. All the other engagements they have with us are unpaid. It's a wish that other office bearers were so committed to cricket. Likewise, my executive committee We meet on a monthly basis. They do not get paid. So to connect the dots, as Mr. Prince has asked you to do on the money, you will see that the SACA's financials, all the money goes to servicing the players. His statements are ridiculous in that regard. Paragraph 142, I'm moving briskly through this. Mr. Prince says he's not aware of all the clauses, so I'm not going to speak about the clauses I'm not 100% sure of. Despite his admission of ignorance, he then says the MOU has made SACA very wealthy. This is just absolutely not true. Disingenuous, it's defamatory. As I've said, SACA does not earn money from CSA. We do not earn a cent out of the MOU monies that get paid. And if you review the MOU, you will see that. I wish we were a wealthy organization. We are not a wealthy organization. One of my key performance areas is how I increase the financial viability of SACA to ensure that we are sustainable and able to service players. The final statement by Mr. Prince is that SACA receives money from the ICC. We receive no money from the ICC. Not true. Under the commercial program, the SANCT receives 20% of ICC revenues to CSA, which is a commercial payment that players receive. SACA receives no money. So as you can see, Mr. Chair, there are a number of statements under Mr. Prince's submission that are extremely disappointing because they are factually incorrect and are easily refuted by just reading the agreements and reviewing our financials. And again, those agreements are obviously all open to your review as well.
On that note, Mr. Briske,
Yes.
will you provide us with those agreements? Because you make reference to them, but they are not attached. Yeah. Yes.
They were forwarded to your office in May. I think I can't remember the date, but we'll get. Yeah.
Okay.
Initially, when we started, we forwarded all the agreements to you, all our commercial agreements, the MOUs.
Okay.
So you do have them. We'll just confirm that they are there.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. I would like you to review them to confirm the statements I have made. Just finishing off, Mr. Chair, there was a statement by Mr. Moreau around victimization of black players. I do believe that the narrative I've had over the last day and a bit proves otherwise. There's statements about pension payouts, which have been canvassed before. I have confided in Mr. July on certain information about the pension provident fund payouts that I did not want to state publicly, so I will ask Mr. July to relay that to the Ombudsman, because I think it's relevant to where that query comes from. The Chair, I will conclude on that basis. I deal with Mr. Manak in more detail just on the selection issue, but the remainder of the written submission before you is actually answers questions that were forwarded to our office, and given that they were forwarded by the office, I will allow you in your own time to review those. I understand and recognize that CSA are waiting outside, so I do not want to take any more time than I have to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Britsky. I can assure you that to the extent that your affidavit is as comprehensive as it is, it will set the backdrop against which we should consider your oral evidence. And it's quite comprehensive.
Thank you, sir.
You make concluding remarks.
I do.
You make concluding remarks on pages
203.
Yes, 133 to 135, paragraphs 203.
I would like to touch on them if I may.
Yeah, I'm inviting you.
I do say, sorry. I do say in conclusion, it is disappointing that your office won't hear the hundreds of stories from players who we've assisted and represented, related to contract terms, agent issues, disciplinary matters, and the thousands of players who benefited from our dual career program, because that is important to us. In moments of crisis, be they medical, family, COVID, disaster, we go beyond the call of duty to serve our players. And these interventions are across race and gender, and we're proud to be able to assist. SACA is the players. I want to emphasize that in closing as well. It's not me sitting here or Mr. Wachipa sitting here. We are the players for the players, and the decisions of the executive relate to the players. We're in the business of protecting and promoting the interests of South African professional cricketers. We've set the minimum standards to make sure there's no exploitation, and people from around the world come to us to see how we do it, to try and have the same protection for their players. And we recognize worldwide as one of the most effective and progressive, because that's important. You've got to change with the times, and we are recognized with that. I do say, Mr. Chair, we're not perfect. There's no organization that's perfect, and we're always open to receive constructive criticism and improve and be better at what we do. And this process has been part of that. We have been criticized. There have been statements that are made which have left me disappointed because I believe that they are not true. But there have been statements where we need to take them on board and we need to see how we do things. And that goes for not just SJN, but when the BLM movement started, that's when our debates started. The importance of transformation in the game cannot be understated. The mere fact that SJN was established shows that there's work to be done in transformation. And as I went through my submission yesterday, those foundations, the leveling the playing fields, the actual targets, the actual development of the player, and the management diversity, we're not there yet. Within those 4 foundations, we've got a lot of work to do. And cricket needs to do that work well to make sure we're not on the front page of the newspaper all the time for reasons that are not cricket reasons. That has got to be our ambition. And by I again, I'm referencing everyone in cricket, not just SACA, but CSA as well. So we accept more work is required, and I have discussed it with you, and we accept that as an organization we must engage internally on further on issues of transformation. And in conclusion, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to have been able to make the submission. On behalf of all the players, we wish you all the very best. And as I said last time, the wisdom of Solomon in finalizing your report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes. I've got just a couple of questions.
Yes, sir.
There hasn't been much mention made of female cricketers. And if my memory serves me well, we have only had a couple of testimonies from female cricketers. I think there were 1 or 2. And I raised this with you in your capacity as a person who has been speaking on behalf of the trade union, and you probably would know why. From the females, there has been no response, or there has not been, even in your dealing with SACA, nothing really has been said about whether there was gender discrimination, given that
Happy to deal with that, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
In our initial submission, we do deal with the Proteas women in quite a bit of detail. And if I take you to paragraph 188 of our paragraph 188 of our submission, you will see us start dealing with the professionalization of the Proteas women over the past 5 years. Those first contracts for Proteas women were awarded in 2014-15, and in the same year they became SACA members. The development of professional team sport for women has been interesting worldwide, not just in South Africa, and that goes for football, even rugby and cricket. We generally have been about 4 or 5 years behind England and Australia, who are the pioneers in this field of women's sport. But effectively in 2014-15 season was the first time women became professional in South African cricket. So they were amateur before. So that was a significant step in terms of the professionalization of the women's game. And in 2018 MOU, for the first time, the women were included into our memorandum of understanding. We're now in a situation where the achieving equality between male and female players was a key issue in our MOU 18. So, for example, women having the same medical aid benefit, the same Provident Fund benefit, having the same travel benefits. So, and that's something as simple as the Proteas men's team flies business class overseas. The Proteas women team must fly business class overseas. In 2018, we also had a significant negotiated a significant increase in the remuneration of the women to levels that made it a good career for them, and also introduced a commercial rights element for the women as well. So they now have commercial rights as well. The reality is the Proteas women earn less than the Proteas men. They do, and that's not unique to South Africa, that's around the world, where the women's teams earn less than the men's teams. And the benchmark type figure is at 25% of what the men earn, which is similar to the rest of the countries around the world. And one of the factors, of course, is the number of days cricket played. So the women do not play Test cricket. They only play T20 cricket and ODI cricket. So if you do an analysis, and we've done a lot of the studies, you'll see in a season where the men, for example, play for 60 days of the year, the women might play for 32 days of the year. So there are those factors as well. Where there has been significant progress at ICC level, which is where FICA does a lot of good work, is around prize money. We increase the prize money for the women to make it a larger amount relative to the men. We are also currently in negotiation with CSA. We actually just concluded it to have a next level of professional women. The great challenge for women's cricket in South Africa has been we've had a Proteas team of 14, 15 contracted women, but nothing below. So your pipeline actually is amateur. It almost doesn't exist. So it's a bit of a luck of the draw if a player comes through. That's prejudicial to the development of the women's game. So why I'm sitting here today and Mr. Wachipa and Mr. Cook, we're dealing with it on Monday and Tuesday, which was so important, is we've actually come to a point where the next level of Proteas, well, of contracted women, which is 40 contracted women, below the 14 Proteas women. That's a significant positive development in terms of women's cricket. They will be semi-professional. They're not fully professional yet, but it's a step in the right direction to increase the number of women playing cricket and earning money from cricket. Just interestingly, the professionalism of the women's game, professionalization of the women's game, should I say, in 2011, if you go to England, was the first time women became members of their association, but 2014, full professional contracts were issued to the English women for the first time. And in 2019, they had their first domestic contracts. So we're in 2021, so we're 2 years behind them. So these countries have all gone through a development phase, and I think importantly, in terms of the role of the SJN, is the plan that CSA have around that development phase. And I know Mr. Eddie Corso, who you will be speaking to just now, is very instrumental in that and will be able to provide you with a lot of information. Australia, 2011, the women became members of Australian Cricket Association and received contracts for the first time. So Australia were actually the first out of the blocks. And then in 2017, women started sharing in their revenue share model, which is also 2018 is when it happened for our women. So you're right to highlight it. We have put it out, some of it in our initial submission, and I've dealt with it in page 188. It's a priority for CSA, it's a priority for SACA. And to that extent, we have two of the Proteas women, Mignon du Preez, who actually sits on the SACA executive committee. She's elected by the players, and she sits on that committee. And Ms. Lizelle Lee, who's actually the SACA representative in the team. And what we have also done is we've designated a specific player development manager, one of our PDMs, Dr. Kirsten van Heerden, who actually deals directly with the Proteas women's team. So it's developing. It's not where I think one wants it to be in terms of the development of the game. But again, this last week has seen a significant movement in the right direction, just in terms of us getting these 40 next level contracts in place. And I think Mr. Khoza will probably be able to give you more information on that, because we've been working closely with him and he's done excellent work in that regard.
I don't understand you to be suggesting that because the rest of the world is still having these disparities in payments between men and females, that South Africa would be justified in maintaining that disparity in remuneration. I mean, the question of remuneration, of course, even in tennis, has been a subject of great and passionate discussions. I am keen to know whether SACRA recognizes that, especially against the backdrop of our Constitution and the equality clause in the Constitution, that there would be no justification for disparity in remuneration on the basis of gender.
I would agree with you that there's no justification for unfairness in the earnings between men and women. I think the discussion around the parity of, if you want to say, equal pay for equal work relative to the women's game, for example, that don't play Test cricket, that they don't perform as much as men. I'm on the same page. I think it's a question of getting to what is fairness in that parity, which is why we have sat with CSA on increasing the women's amounts effectively in MOU 2018 considerably from where it was. I don't think we're there yet as to where it should be, but I think another element to that is the commercial program of the women. We haven't got, what's the word I'm looking for, a comprehensive enough commercial program for the women, which is another angle we need to work with CSA on achieving that. Momentum have stepped up, and I think it's time that other businesses also stepped up to the women's game. And I think if you're right, we shouldn't compare with other countries. We've got to do our own things, but one can learn from other countries as well. And for example, England with the 100 competition, where they've teamed up with the men and the women, is a good example of where they've done that. So I take your point, sir.
Now, in the course of these hearings, if my memory serves me well, prominent members, most of them in the Proteas team, were mentioned in these hearings, and my sense, if I recall things that were said about them, would have called ordinarily, in my view, for them to come and rebut some of the allegations were made. For instance, and it has been covered by some of the people who spoke or purported to speak on their behalf, that there were allegations about the impropriety of how one, the prominent current players rose to positions of leadership, director of cricket, and how they or he, no sooner was he in that position, went on to appoint somebody who is his friend into another prominent position. I'm sure you're aware of whom I am referring to. Now, there have been responses by them, if my memory serves me well, by way of affidavit. And when I've been asked publicly, by those who got to know that they had submitted. In fact, I was asked by one of the current players whether he should publish his entire response or responses to the allegations And I said to him, whilst I had no objection to him doing so, and in fact I had no power to prohibit him from doing so, what would be of benefit to everybody, including me, including him, would be a situation where he was able to come and make a presentation, and then I would raise questions which are not easily dealt with by what is in his affidavit. And the latest that I know of is that he has declined to do so. Now, I know you are not the players that I'm talking about. Do you perhaps know why they would not have taken the opportunity to come themselves and clarify some of the aspects? I know that some of them are still on tour and all of that, but yeah.
It's difficult for me to answer, Mr. Chair. Where I sit as the CEO of SACA, a number of statements have been made against SACA, and I thought it important for me to come in person and refute those and take certain positions and give information to you that I thought we think will be of assistance to you in making the determination. Insofar as individual players, past players, administrators have had statements made about them and have submitted affidavits but are deciding not to come, very difficult for me to comment. I would assume there's a nervousness to come to a hearing like this. I've been nervous coming to a hearing like this. It's not a situation one is used to being in. And if people feel uncomfortable in that, I assume that might be a consideration.
You have done very well for a nervous person, Mr. Pirutsky, if I have to say so. You have not done badly at all for a person who was nervous coming here. Anyway, sorry to interrupt, yes.
Yeah. And if I may say, maybe it would take a more personal invitation from the Office of the Ombudsman to speak to that person and understand their concerns as to being in front of the hearing, and maybe that would assist the process. As a labour lawyer and as a trade unionist, I always believe communication directly can maybe get you answers to why a certain situation exists. And maybe this is a case for that as well, as compared to the mere formality of being in the hearing process. I'm not too sure.
Yeah.
Mr. Britsky, I just have one question. Do you know why current players haven't really come forward to the SJN hearings? I know it's been mostly past players. When
we first got the communications from yourself, back in, I can't remember what it was, April, I think, we immediately went to all players and we said, here's an opportunity to come forward. We actually did it formally on 2 occasions, and we did it individually with players. One answer to that is going to sound somewhat political, is I do believe some of the issues around, specifically at Croce's level, that maybe came up in earlier years. I do think some of the situations have improved for players. I think Dr. Musaji also said that at the time. I think that's a factor. I also think there was a nervousness. We did put certain questions forward to the Office of the Ombudsman to try and allay the fears of some players who came and said to us, will I be victimized? And we were even considering an anonymous type of approach, which we said to players that can happen. So I think there are a variety of factors. Our encouragement to players was to say that you can do this without anyone else being involved. In other words, it can come directly literally to yourself, man. So it wouldn't need to go through a province. It doesn't even need to go through SACA. So I think it's probably a variety of factors. Do I think that there's possibly a fear amongst players that if I come out and say my current coach did the following, that it might impact my career, I think that's a reality. I think one can't get away from that. And as much as we would say to a player, don't worry about that, we'll protect you, that doesn't really work like that in practice. So I'd have to say I think that's also a factor, which is why I think one of our questions was, what would the status be of an anonymous submission, which obviously makes it difficult for you. Because an anonymous submission is very much in the air. It makes your job almost impossible. But we canvassed that purely because I think that fear is out there. So sadly, I think that is a reality of life in any type of inquiry situation, which despite us trying to get around it, possibly was an important factor.
Well, the anonymous testifiers are a reality of these sort of inquiries. That was the case in the so-called Marikana Commission, and for my sins, I was participating in the, and that has been manifest also in the Zondo Commission. But, yeah. But the point you make is made. Well, Mr. Bieska, you will be pleased to know that we have no further questions to put to you. And I only have to thank you for having come. I don't take that for granted. And I also have to thank you for the comprehensive response that you made in your submission, in the affidavit, and the helpful explanations, of some of these paragraphs which you coerced from the chair to summarize because of the strictures of time under which we operate. I can only promise you that before I write the report that I need to do so, every consideration will be given to what is sworn testimony by way of affidavit when I look it alongside of what the record will reveal to have been your testimony under oath. For a person to come here, in spite of the fact that you probably had reservations, like others who have reservations appearing before the commission in public and all of that, you came and you did what you think ought to inform us in the consideration of what the truth in the end is. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Advocate Dumisa. Thank you, Mr. July. And on behalf of the players, I thank you and again wish you good luck. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will adjourn.
Oh, I was going to say they wanted
Yes.
about 10 minutes because they need to restructure.
Yes, yeah. We are at 11:10 now. We will adjourn until 11:20 for the man of the moment, or the organization of the moment, CSA. How many how many are we getting from CSA? Two. Okay. Right. 20 past, eh?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Yes. It's 11:30 on my watch. And Mr. Musaji, you indicated there would be 2 people who would be sworn in.
Yes.
Yes. And let's start with you. And I assume you are Mr. Koza.
That's correct.
Your full name is Mr. Koza.
My name is Edward Koza.
Those are your full names.
Those are my full names.
Okay. Yeah. Mr. Edward Koza, are you going to take the oath or are you going to affirm?
I'll take the oath.
Now, Mr. Edward Koza, do you swear that the testimony you are going to give to me here is going to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing else but the truth? If that is so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you. Mr. Musaji, I would proceed on the assumption that you'll do as you did the last time.
Yes. Should we swear in Mr. Van Zyl as well?
Do you want to go? Oh, you can take the oath from where you are. What are your full names, Mr. Van Zyl?
Mr. Chair, is not as short as Mr. Koza. It's Cornelius Johannes Petrus Gerardus van Zyl.
All of those names,
All of
Mr.
those.
Van Zyl, do you swear that the evidence you are going to give when the time comes will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing else but the truth? And if that is so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
It is so help me God.
Thank you. When the time comes, we'll just get into in the podium and we'll do what has to be done.
Mr. Koza, can you tell us who your current employer is?
My current employer is Cricket South Africa.
And when did you join Cricket South Africa?
I joined Cricket South Africa on the 15th of November in 2013.
And what is your current position at Cricket South Africa?
I'm actually the acting head of Cricket Pathways. When I started at Cricket South Africa, I was a senior cricket manager. And then they advertised a job for cricket services manager. I applied for that. And then when our shenanigans started at CSA, and then that's where I found myself in the acting head of cricket pathway capacity.
Thank you. When, during the period 2013 to 2019, when I understand Mr. Van Zyl had been suspended, who did you report to?
During the period of?
23rd, or when you started at CSA until 2019, when Mr. Van Zyl was suspended, who did you report to?
I was reporting to Mr. Van Zyl when I started at Cricket South Africa.
Okay. You have filed a statement which was signed by you on the 20th of September 2021. This is the statement. I just want to confirm that that is the statement that was signed by you.
That is correct.
Do you confirm that the contents of the statement is correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Okay, thank you. You deal with various topics in your statement, and those topics relate to remuneration of players, CSA's transformation structures, selection, cricket facilities and infrastructure, the impact of fitness requirements in relation to selection, the issues raised by specific players during these hearings, umpires and coaches, and the issues relating to lotto funding, and then certain remaining issues that arose during the course of these hearings. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
We will not deal with remuneration because I think it will be better off allowing Mr. Van Zyl to talk through the issues relating to remuneration, given that you were reporting to him at the time. I'm going to then take you to the issue, however, of remuneration of women's players. You deal with that in paragraphs 53 to 68 of your statement. Can you, and you deal with it particularly because Zola Tamai had painted a dismal picture of the early periods of women's cricket. And but she didn't deal in any significant detail with any of the strides that have been made in trying to improve the position for women cricketers. So can you just take us through your statement and particularly paragraphs 55 to 68 in relation to the remuneration of women's cricket and other benefits for women's cricket?
That is correct, Chair. Now, maybe from the onset, I need to highlight the fact that Mrs. Zola Tamai was a team manager of the Proteas back in the years. And I remember also spending some time with her during 2005 when South Africa hosted the World Cup. She's someone who is well vested and well experienced and added loads of value to where we find ourselves. I think in her testimony, what I picked up is that she spoke about her living experience as a team manager. And she came short as far as outlining where the women's cricket has actually improved during the processes. But be as it may, I'm here to be able to fill in the gaps and all that. Because remember, at the time as well, when we were busy with trying to transition women's cricket, Ms. Zola Tamai also became a board member, which was very instrumental in assisting us to get women's cricket to the position where it finds itself. I think the key issue here for us is that now, when you look at the investment in women's cricket, it's quite equally important to look at women's cricket in its entirety, from development right until the national team. One needs to acknowledge from the onset that the past players that used to play under Ms. Zola Tamai, they were not even contracted at that time. And the issue which is also vital is that now most of the players at that time, when they have to play for the national team, they actually had to go and ask for leave. And at most, when you had to compensate them, it will be a minimal fee of a tour fee. But the issue which was very vital for us to transition and be able to make sure that we can hold our own in world cricket, we needed to make sure that we transition women's cricket. And in doing that, the contracting process became a paramount important for Cricket South Africa. And we had a bit of an experiment at the time where we contracted 6 players. And let alone the amounts are stated within these players, the amounts that they received at the time. And that was more or less around about the 2013 period. But when you do something, you also don't see the unintended consequences. Because the progress of the 6 players that were contracted, their performance, their skill level, and everything else actually superseded the rest of the squad, because now they became professionals. They started dedicating themselves to the game of cricket, and all of a sudden they were practicing more than the ad hoc players. And when we could see that these players actually have improved drastically, we realized actually now we need to probably go back to the drawing board and approach the board again to say, now, this thing of only contracting 6 is not sufficient enough, because we're leaving the other players behind. And that's where Mr. Van Zyl came in through a thorough process and started motivating other aspects in terms of now we need to contract more women players. And as you're well aware, normally you piggyback from what's happening within the men's pathway. And so at the time, we increased the contract from 16 to 14. And as you will highlight, as far as the men's contract, at the time we were still using categories as far as awarding of contracts were concerned. And I must highlight as well that, remember, this was at an embryo stage, so the amounts were not as much as significant as what it is today. But be as it may, blessings to the board, they saw the vision, they increased the number of contracts, but also in that sense as well, we needed to ensure that the system holistically as well at the bottom starts being given the necessary attention. But to take you through the contracts and all those type of issues, you'll notice that already in the 2014-2015 season, in the category A, we had 3 black players that were awarded contracts. In the category B, we had 2 players out of the 4. And then in category C, we had 2 players. And so out of the 14 contracts that were offered in that particular year, 7 were of women of color. And the issue which is very vital also to highlight on the onset, transformation has never been an issue within the context of women's cricket on our part at the time. Because the issue which was very vital is that it was developing, and it was quite important for us was to set up structures that they can actually sustain what we saw with the initial stages of contracting the 6 players. When you look at the 2015-2016 period, you will notice as well that we continued with the 3 black players contracted within the A category, and we kept the 2 black players in category B, but all of a sudden in category C we increased, so there was 1 player added to the mix. And then in 2016, 2017 as well, you'll notice as well that we also had an increase on players of color that were contracted out of the 14 at the time, because our numbers moved to 9. And that became evident when you look at that in category A, we still had the 3 black players. And then also in category B, we had the 4 black players. And in category C, we had 2 black players. Now, this is where one has to bring into an issue that over time, contracts had to be given attention. Because remember, we started at a minimum base amount. But the team was doing so well, actually, they were boxing above their weight against their international counterparts. And when you look at the contracts that were given and the increases and all that, there were numerous increases that were given by CSA at different stages to try and make sure that we can increase the allocation of salaries for women. And please, I mustn't be get wrong in terms of where we are now. It's a completely different environment to where we were. There's a significant improvement that is
where
done
we were
in 2013. So currently, when you look at the processes that we had to adopt, we looked at that's category A, B, and C system was also a bit of a hindrance, because now you can only issue a certain amount of contracts per category. So if there's players that are progressing well, you find that they're in category C. If there's no gap to fill in a player in category B and the category B players are performing, that player in category C has to wait for their period almost. And we needed to find an agile system and probably look at another way. And that's where you had probably through various testimonies around the ranking system. But let alone the animal in the room is that you're trying to make sure that when you improve what's happening as far as the income of the players, but you also have to structure the support in the domestic setup to be able to sustain what you do internationally. Because remember, when you lose your contract as a women's player, there was no professional structure. So you could actually move from earning money to nothing. And those are the things that you found that gave us sleepless nights, because we needed to find avenues to say, now, how are we going to make sure that while we're trying to sustain and keep this team competitive internationally, and also to make sure that the remuneration-wise and the system itself is evolving. So where I plead with you, Chair, is to make sure that when we start discussing the investment on women's cricket, it needs to be looked at in total component. Because our strategy was clear and simple. We needed to make sure that whatever we do mirrors what we do with the men's structure. So when we saw the improvement of the players, we started a National Academy for Women. And that was also investment that we made in the mix. And the first intake was definitely the national contracted players in the first year, because we needed to close the gap between the 6 players and the rest that were in the setup. And then post the issue around the National Academy being introduced, you also needed to look at where are these players coming from. And predominantly, some of them will come through a normal club setup. Some of them will come from a school setup. And you find that now all of a sudden they represent their provinces, they get identified and they get put into the processes. But without nodding to mix the issues, let me stick for now around the contracting process. So when we in 2018, 2019, and adopted the ranking system for women's cricket, it was still the 14 contracts that we were offering. Already you could see that 3 black players were in the top 8 ranking category. Because when I say race has never been an issue from that aspect when it comes to women's cricket, is that most of the players that we started with, because when we got involved in 2013, we had a roadmap. We realized that the players we had there were young, and that if we invest in them, probably we'll eat the fruits later on in the years. And while we're doing that, we'll try and improve their earnings and anything that goes with it. So back in 2014, which was bold at the time, we committed to say, 2019, we want to prepare these ladies to reach at least the semi-final of a World Cup. And in 2020, we want to make sure that they win the World Cup. But in hindsight, when you look at it, you're actually proud. Because when we went to Australia, the team ended up in the semi-final of the World Cup. And it's purely because of the investment that has been put in and the structures that were set up at the time. But sometimes your plan becomes your Murphy's Law, because I wonder why did we choose at the time and say a semi-final we'll be happy with. And then we end up in the semi-final in a rain-affected match.
What was the demography of that team that went to Australia?
The demographics of our women's team has always been around about 50%. So that's why I said from a chair, it's also very important to highlight. That World Cup was the first time we actually were going with a fully fit national team. Because as we try and professionalize women's cricket, we also have to add fitness trainers, we had to add team doctors, we had to actually add physios, because we needed to professionalize this environment. And all these issues come at a cost to CSA. And the issue which is very vital at the time was that now, leading up to that World Cup, at no series have we actually had the opportunity of selecting our full best side. So that World Cup was actually the first tester where all the players that were contracted were available and went to a World Cup. And the result speaks for itself.
Mr. Koza, can I... The question that has been asked was the demographics of that team. And at one stage, or more than once, you mentioned that race was never an issue. Can you expand on that?
So, Chair, in the setup, I think you have one of the world-leading bowlers, Shebnem Ashma, who is a black lady. You have a phenomenal partner in Ayabonga Kaka, who's black African, who originates from our program at Forte. We run an academy there in the silent Bundu areas there, and we're doing some good work in terms of actually shaping players for the environment. I mean, Ayabonga Kaka is actually a good product and an example of a well-rounded individual who actually got a degree and while still pursuing a career as a cricketer. And where she ended up, she's one of the leading bowlers currently in the Protea setup. And then you'll have a person like Nondumiso Mlaba, for example, who went to the World Cup for the first time. This is someone, Chair, who comes from KZN. Her journey to practice was 5 hours and want to have the ambitions of playing for this Momentum Protea team. And through the needs assessments and other issues that we conduct, we tend to sometimes diagnose those challenges. And you find that then we make interventions on them. Where she is at the moment, and we're proud of what she's achieved. Because we tend to take things for granted, because we're not just dealing with the normal human being as a cricketer. Because here we're dealing with people. So the player that walks through my door, I need to look at them as a player, as a person first before the player. Because they come with different challenges and circumstances. And Mlaba's circumstances here were that if we don't make interventions and put her closer to Kingsmead, where she could be in decent facilities and getting coaching, we were going to come short at the time. Because
Mr. Koza, it's a very simple question. What was the demography of that team which you sent to the World Cup in that year?
It's 7 players, of which 4 were black African and 3 were black.
No white?
And then the other players, 8 other players were white, sorry. Because we took 15 to the World Cup.
That takes me to 11.
7 and 8.
7 and 8.
Oh, 15.
To my recollection, yes, 7 and 8.
Okay.
But I can check for you. It's because 7 and 8.
Sorry,
because
Chair. Mr. Koza, can I just check whether your memory is correct? Because if in paragraph 58.7 of your statement, you give details there about the contracted players in the 2019-2020 season.
I see, 58.7.
With 58.7, there were 5 black female cricketers amongst the top 10 earning female cricketers. And 8 of the 14 contracted players were black. Yeah, so it was 8-7. It was the other way around. Yeah, it's the other way around.
Yes. Yes, Mr. Koza.
Mr. Koza, can you talk about a significant improvement in the remuneration of female players, and you set that out in paragraph 60 of your affidavit or statement. Please take us through that.
Yes, Chair. I think during that period, Chair, there was also significant increases in the fixed amounts that were paid to female cricketers. And in there, we're highlighting an increase of around about 450% for that period, because we started these players in 2013 at a certain amount, and over time, during our engagements and all that, they actually got serious bump ups in terms of their salaries. But let alone, these issues also comes with the other perks that went with being a professional cricketer.
We'll get to that, Mr. Koza. You do deal with that later. In paragraph 64 and 65, you then talk about additional increases that were introduced in November 2017 and August 2018. And then you talk about additional benefits as well. Please take us through that.
Correct, yeah. I think in November 2017, CSA and SACA, because SACA is the representatives of the players, we engaged at that time and we gave the players a pool amount of 3.5 million investment towards their salaries as one of the portions of an increase in the setup. And then there was also another further increase, because actually this was like happening in consecutive years. And this was another further 2.9 million that was actually invested in the salaries of women. And this was, it's over a 4-year period. And then definitely this was also at the time where we started introducing a ranking system. So that ranking system actually also perpetuated us to make sure that we can actually increase the amount of budget that was allocated to women so that we can make the contracts more meaningful.
You then, in paragraph 67, sorry, just let me take you back to 65. What were some of the additional benefits that were introduced?
Chair, yeah, we speak about the issues which is very important at the time, and I think one of the key significant issues definitely, women when they played, they never got match fees. And one of the issues that we needed to look into was to bring in match fees at that level. And then definitely the other issues that we had to look at was to have a top-up contract introduced. So now, for example, a top-up contract would work in an avenue where a non-contracted player plays a certain amount of matches for the Protea women. And if you reach a certain point, that automatically converts into you getting an additional contract, which CSA has to fund, which means that actually for that year, we're actually sitting with 15 contracts. And then also, which is significant as well, is that normally when the women used to tour, they used to share rooms. And we had to make a decision to make sure that they have single rooms. And also at the time as well, prior to that period, they were also flying, they were not flying business class, and we needed to introduce business class flights for them. And also, which is very significantly important, was the improvements of the support staff around women, because we introduced an assistant coach, a medical doctor, and officially a team manager now, because previously the team manager used to do an ad hoc basis, but we hired those people on a full-time basis. And besides that, Chair, is that they started getting other mutual benefits like medical aid, as well as cell phone allowances and all that.
In paragraph 68 of your affidavit, you then deal with another aspect that was introduced to improve the position for women cricketers. Please tell us about that.
Yes, Chair, as you're well aware that initially women were not part of the SACA agreements and all that, and we needed to, as we professionalize women's cricket, we also needed to bring them into the mix. And one of the avenues that was always bone in contention was also to include them in the MOU and making sure that they actually been taken care of when it comes to the shared revenue allocation to players. And this was the first time actually that they were considered for such, because that would have meant an additional income to the players.
And take us through paragraph 68, where you talk of another thing that was introduced for women's cricket.
Chair, I think the one underestimated issue is a personal development plan of an individual. Because the key issue that we've introduced at the time was to ensure that each and every one of our players has a personal development plan. And the intent of that personal development plan was to ensure that we actually oversee the development of the individual and make sure that any performance gaps that might exist in relation to their performances are closed up and identified and discussed with the player, and so that the interventions are realigned correctly. But also at that time, we also spoke about we introduced the national contract upgrades, and I've alluded to this earlier on when I said the upgrades were normally given to players that were honoring women's fixtures, but they were not fully contracted. And if they reach a certain level of matches, they were getting an upgrade, and it will normally sometimes be backdated to the beginning of the season.
Mr. Khoza, then in paragraphs 69 to 93, you deal with the differences in men's and women's benefits or remuneration. And you concede that the males earn more generally than their female counterparts. Can you take us through the reasons for that?
Correct, Chair. I think what is quite important is that although we acknowledge that we've made some strides in the development of women's cricket, but we know where we see the women's cricket needs to be. But it must be accepted that the male cricketers are remunerated higher than the women's cricketers. It's a fact. And also it must be acknowledged that the amount of matches played between the two entities also is a gap. And that's not a gap that actually only impacts Cricket South Africa, but it's a global issue. So men cricketers play more competition. They play test matches, where female cricketers are playing World Cups and bilateral tours that you find that are being organized, and the amount of matches that are actually being exposed to has significantly improved as well over the years, because there's a drive from ICC as well as members globally to try and improve the stature of women's cricket.
How many test matches do women cricketers play?
I mean, if you take it in the current contracted players, I think they've only been exposed to one test match, which was back in the day. And they've never been exposed to any test match cricket, because the two formats that have been pushed under women's cricket is T20 cricket as well as ODI.
In paragraph 70 of your affidavit, you set out where CSA's revenue is generated from. Please explain that to us.
Correct. CSA it's a business which financially revolves around the various mechanisms. And the biggest one which cannot be undermined is the broadcast rights. And that is at 47% of our general total income. And it's quite important because this actually speaks to how we structure the business over a 4-year period. I know people have spoken about a 4-year cycle, especially Mr. Bresky spoke about the MOU lasting for 4 years, purely because of, in that cycle of 4 years, you more or less guaranteed 1 good year of a setup, and then the other 3 years you might be running with losses, and also you have to balance it out over a 4-year period. But also 26% of our income revolves around ICC distributions that we're getting, and definitely 16% is sponsorships.
Let's then go to broadcasting revenue, which is almost half of CSA's revenue. Do the broadcasters pay you for broadcasting women's cricket?
No. We actually do the other way around. We piggyback from men's content. If you look at in the last 3 years or so, we've tried to actually bring T20 matches, especially if you find out, let's say, South Africa is playing India. We try and make sure that we schedule a tour against India women, and we probably will play as a curtain raiser to the main game. Because initially it was quite hard for the broadcasters actually to broadcast women's cricket match on its own. But where we are at the moment, this is a global phenomenon. I mean, we've made strides and where you find that actually it becomes a content on its own now in terms of broadcasting, but still we're not getting anything for it.
But why? Sorry. Why these broadcasters don't want to pay? Because as I understand, you are saying if you look at the salaries, remuneration of women, it's not by design that we deliberately pay them less. It's because the money that we pay salaries for comes from broadcasting and this and this. And if there is no broadcasting right money, then you are definitely going to give them less than the men's remuneration, because there's a lot of money, comparatively speaking, to why are the broadcasters not coming to the party?
I think, Mr. July, the key issue here is the period of development in terms of where the women's cricket is. Because if you had to take it back maybe pre-2016, to just get a game on TV was by sheer luck. Where we are now, we're engaging with broadcasters actually to say, what is your schedule like? Can we piggyback on that? So now, I think the more matches are being seen on TV, and the more following in terms of the women's game globally happens. Because the ICC did a stat in 2019. The sustainability of men's cricket will heavily revolve around the success of women's cricket down the line, because the following of men's cricket is predominantly female. So now if we can convert that supportship towards the women's game, I think it's something that will add value down the line.
If I may ask, there's been a theme that seems to suggest that some of the things that we did here could not be out of sync with the general trend internationally. In other words, I mean, even you saying, even overseas, there's this disparity in remunerations. And I want to ask whether there are limiting factors for South Africa, being who South Africa is. We always want to lead the pack. Why are we seeking to do things only if they are also done internationally, when we would be convinced that what we need to do is the correct thing to do?
Chair,
Is it because we are sponsored financially by others? I just want to understand. I mean, I'm sure you are not going to sit there and say and defend disparity, for
Correct,
instance, in salaries. It is manifestly not right.
correct.
It's unfair, and in a country that boasts, constitutionalism, boasts apartheid, and where equality in various forms is central to its conduct generally. You would expect South Africa to say, well, yeah, we have got a constitutional mandate in all walks of life to be guided by the commands of the Constitution as far as equality is concerned, even parity of remuneration. But it seems to me, from your evidence and from other contributions which were made, even by Mr. Pritzker, it seems to me that we feel that there is a constraint. Is it commercial, or where would you assist me with explaining why we seem to be reluctant to?
I think, Chair, it's not an issue of reluctance. It's how deep your pockets are. Because if your pockets are that deep, it's easy to actually maximize the process. And allow me at this juncture probably use a scenario where one of our players was called into a forum by the minister, just before the current Minister of Sport. They needed to discuss women's cricket issues. I mean, probably our player was like number 7 in the queue of all the sporting coaches. And all these women were declaring what they're going through, that they're not even in a professional structure, they're not earning any income, they're facing all sorts of issues in relation to traveling. It actually cost them more to play cricket and all those type of issues. By the time they came to our player, Chair, she didn't know what to say, because whatever these other women players were saying about their sport and what's happening in the country was unfamiliar to her. But if you had to put someone who played cricket before 2013 in the same seat and look at their experiences, they'll speak differently. So the issue which is very vital is, I must, at this juncture, also commend the previous boards of CSA. Because whenever we came to them with a plan to say we want to make sure that we spend more money on women's cricket, whether it was development or whatever, and we motivated our reasons, they've always made sure that they put our financial committee under pressure to say, make the resources available. The danger to cricket is that the resources, it cannot be a once-off. It's a continuous. So if you don't generate revenue like now, no one would have anticipated the COVID situation. And our income stream has been affected, let alone the challenges that we were faced with administratively. So now when the income takes a dip, you can't go back to something that you've implemented and tell the player, sorry, now we no longer want to professionalize. And that's why most of the things have to be done in a responsible and sustainable manner. And what we've done up to now is surely what we can afford.
Mr. Koza, in response to the Ombudsman's question about whether the remuneration is unfair, you very quickly gave the answer that it is unfair. And I understand the notion that we should be striving for parity between women and men's cricket. Even if we strive for that parity, am I correct in saying that women will still earn less than men?
That is correct, sir.
And why is that the case?
Definitely the amount of cricket and the formats becomes a key contention here. Because remember, the players, for example, on the male side, they have their portions of how they make their money. Besides the retainer, retainer is one issue. The other issues around match fees and other things. So the more content you have, the more money the players are making.
In essence, you're saying that the men get to play more forms of cricket, number one, and even in the different forms, they often would play more games than women.
Correct. Because a simple case, Chair, will be if a Protea player plays a test match, and that takes place over 5 days, his match fee will be significant compared to a guy who's played a T20 match. And that's a fact.
Okay, let's compare apples with apples now. As I understand, if you are playing a woman who plays T20 and a man who plays T20, do they earn the same salary? Because this other one that you're talking about, it's where I earn more because of the number of games, as compared to, do we get equal salary for the game that you play? Are women contracted for T20 the same as men who are contracted for T20?
Okay, Mr. July, maybe let me just put clarity on one issue. Where we are from a CSA perspective is that in the men's side, we're contracting, let's say, 17 cricketers. And when the conveners of selectors, as well as once they've done the necessary processes of doing the ranking system and otherwise, we're working with a pot of money that gets allocated. In that 17 contracts, there probably will be guys that are predominantly strong in a particular format. But they are part of that particular mix of contracting of the 17. Because normally when you look at how the contracting are working, depending on what is prioritized for that particular year on the formats, it normally mirrors the upcoming year's FTP, which is the Future Tours program. But when you come to the women's, remember what I said is that you are still working with an embryo stage. So their budget, total budget for contract, it's not as equivalent to what is in men, because the issue here is the total amount that is available there. It's not about you playing in the, what do you call it, because I'm a T20 specialist. And unfortunately, our players, for all women players, are actually contracted for all formats.
What informs the budget?
Definitely what informs the women's budget is definitely for when it comes to the incomes themselves. Because remember, like I've highlighted, the 3 spheres of our income. through broadcast rights and all those type of issues. So in our negotiations with SACA, we negotiate all these minimums and maximums of all contracts for men and women to say what are they going to be paid and all those type of issues. So that's why I say the issue of parity comes back again to the issue of how deep the pocket is and the income stream. Because the one issue that is quite vital is that now, while we're speaking the income of the players, we also have to acknowledge the improvements and the investment that is made in broadening the base.
Just if I understand your evidence of earlier today, you made the point that from the broadcasters, you get no revenue for women's cricket.
Correct.
Even though they've started to increase the broadcasting of women's cricket. So the broadcasting revenue you get relates only to men's cricket. What's the position relating to sponsorship? Are you getting sponsors putting more money into men's cricket or more money in women's cricket?
No, definitely, historically, is that the investment has always been on men's cricket. And I think when, at the time when Momentum came into the picture, they were sponsoring the domestic game, the international events, and they more or less looked at this event of women's cricket in terms of their contribution there as a end tier. But let alone, which was quite significant, I remember at the time we were in a sponsorship review meeting with Momentum. And this was at the peak of the Momentum Project team. Because remember, this team, as much as we've invested in it, it was boxing above their weight, meaning for the level that they were and everything that goes with the development of women's cricket in South Africa, they were actually producing internationally. And when they did their stock count in terms of their contribution of sponsorship, I remember one of the guys made a serious comment, and I left at that and said to myself, hang on, it seems like as Cricket South Africa, we're on to something. Because he made a statement to say we're getting more mileage from the women's team compared to our sponsorship on the domestic game. At that time, it was the franchise 50-over competition. That to me was a strong and bold statement at the time, and we realized that, hang on, we have to invest in the pathway. Because down the line, we'll probably eat the fruits of what we're trying to develop at this stage. Because if we're already starting to see those strides that the impact of coverage, the impact of sponsorship value is starting to actually make a dent in that regard. So that's why I think our issue was always to say, now let this pool of players not be a one-year wonder. Let's rather invest holistically in the development and make sure that we can have a sustainable pathway system.
What would you say, does men's cricket subsidize women's cricket?